Welcome to the first ever episode of the Gen X Juggler Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. And the fact that you are here leads me to assume that you, like me, are a card-carrying member of the totally awesome club known as Generation X. We were the latchkey kids, raised on TV dinners and MTV. But it was fun, wasn't it? We didn't let a little Cold War keep us from enjoying ourselves. And we must have made an impression because we are still a topic of conversation. Have you heard all the names Gen X has acquired over the years? The middle child generation, the sandwich generation. In fact, I almost called this podcast Deb's Deli, a podcast for the sandwich generation. But my husband told me it sounded like a cooking podcast. You won't find many recipes here. Some recipes for life, maybe, but that's about it. We've also been called the new lost generation and the forgotten generation. I can't say that I currently feel forgotten. I actually feel like everyone knows where I am all the time and what they need me to do. But I do feel a bit lost sometimes. I find myself looking around for the grown-ups only to realize, oh yeah, that's me. Yep, gone are the carefree, almost feral days of being a kid in the 80s. I remember riding bikes with my friends all over town, completely unsupervised, like a little motorless biker gang, or walking to the convenience store to buy candy cigarettes and IBC root beer, then strolling home at dusk, chugging on brown bottles with cigarettes hanging out of our 10-year-old mouths, looking like somebody's out-of-work uncle, only to be greeted by our completely unbothered parents with, "Did you kids have fun?" And the answer was always a resounding yes. Sometimes I feel sorry for my kids that their childhoods will never be quite as cool as ours. Unfortunately, the 80s couldn't last forever, but I still get to enjoy glimpses of the past every now and then. For instance, my daughter recently had 80s Day at school. I was so excited to take her back in time. I dressed her in Levi's with ripped knees and a Def Leppard t-shirt. I tied a bandana around one leg, of course, and another around her wrist for good measure. I teased her hair all up to high heaven and set it with copious amounts of hairspray. By the time I was done, she looked a lot like I did circa 1993, especially the hair. After working my magic, I sat back and waited for her to tell me how much she loved it. Instead, she took one look in the mirror and said, "Mom, I look like I just climbed out of a dumpster." I guess some people just don't know what cool is. There's no denying times have changed along with the hairstyles. Now we're the ones making the chore lists and juggling all of the responsibilities. Do you remember those variety shows we used to watch in the 80s? Sometimes there would be a juggler, and he would start by juggling 3 balls to simple melodic music, but gradually increase the amount of balls he was juggling one by one as the music would speed up and swell along with the tension in the room as we waited with bated breath to see when or if everything would just come crashing down around him. I have days when I feel like that variety show juggler. I'm constantly adding to what I'm already juggling in life, raising the one child I have left at home and managing my household while caring for my aging parents, keeping up with my adult children, being the mother-in-law that I want to be to my sweet daughters-in-love, as I call them, and being the best lovey I can be to my precious little granddaughter who will be 2 in a couple of months. Being a Gen X juggler isn't easy. It's a mixed bag of blessings and stressors vying for our attention. Sometimes we have so many balls in the air that the occasional drop of 1 or 2 is inevitable, and sometimes we have to voluntarily put one down. But everything we juggle is so important. Just making sure our kids and parents get what they need and get where they need to go can take up entire days. At the same time, our own lives are evolving at warp speed. We're becoming empty nesters and looking toward retirement, and possibly stressing out a bit that we're only just now thinking about retirement. Or we may even be thinking about starting new careers and all that we need to do to make that happen at this stage of life. And in the midst of all of this, we're constantly reminded how important it is to make time for ourselves, to practice self-care, and even have some fun along the way to help maintain what's left of our sanity. Self-care, fun. Yes, let me add that to my calendar, if I can find the space. It's a lot, but I'm not complaining. I just need more time to practice my juggling. For now, I'm beholden to the calendar reminders on my phone. It could be worse. I don't even want to think about a world where my life is just stagnant and nobody needs me. That wouldn't be any fun at all. I'm happy to be a Gen X juggler. And that, as I suspect you already deduced, since you're obviously very smart, is the origin of this podcast. Welcome, my fellow juggler. I invite you to join me as we walk through this uncharted territory of midlife together. Help yourself to some coffee, tea, or maybe even an IBC root beer if you have one on hand. Sit back, relax. I'm just kidding. I know you don't have time for that. I'm happy to go alongside you as you meet the demands of your day. That's what friends do, and it's definitely what Gen X Juggler friends do. Since we're friends now, I should probably make a proper introduction. I'm Deb, a 49-year-old wife, mother of 3, 2 boys ages 27 and 24, and a 14-year-old daughter, whom I actually enjoy most of the time. Honestly, I consider myself a mother of 5 now that my daughters in love have joined the family. And as I mentioned before, I'm blessed to have been my sweet granddaughter's lovey for almost 2 years. She's my little best friend and so much fun. I'm also the only child of 2 good, hardworking parents who are now in their 80s and who need a fair amount of help these days. And I, like you, am interested in finding ways to make the hard stuff a bit easier, or at least to make life a bit less overwhelming at times. But I want you to know this is not a woe is me podcast where misery loves company and we just sit around belly aching about how demanding our lives are. On the contrary, I intend to celebrate this busy time of life. I'm grateful that my plate is full because it means I have people who love me and need me. I feel like I have more purpose now than I've ever had before. It's an exciting time of life, and I honestly wouldn't trade it for the world. In the same breath, I'm learning that I can't do it all alone, and you shouldn't have to either. That's why I'm here. My goal is to provide you with some good resources for the journey ahead and some good stories to get you through the day. I'll cover topics that matter most to us, the Gen X jugglers. I got my introduction to the world of being a Gen X juggler about 4 years ago. I will say that one of the most unexpected aspects of being in midlife for me was the shift that took place as my parents aged, and I went from being the cared for to being the caregiver. My parents had always been healthy and active. They loved to travel and socialize. But in their late 70s, things started to change. They would ask me to go to their doctor's appointments with them because they struggled to hear and remember what the doctor would say. My dad gradually became less active and physically weaker due to atrial fibrillation. He would get dizzy when he stood up and he was afraid of falling, so he would just sit a lot. I learned that use it or lose it is more than just a clever phrase. It eventually became difficult for him to even get out of his easy lift chair. My mother remained active for a while after my dad slowed down. She's one of those people who never could sit still for very long, always needing something to do. I wish I had gotten that gene. It would be really helpful right now. But a couple of years ago, my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. This was the first major game changer in their ability to live completely independently. Mom always took care of all the details of daily life, but the details were becoming more and more difficult for her to keep up with. At the time, I lived relatively close by and was able to go by and check on them and take them to their appointments and make sure they had groceries. But then we were thrown a curveball. My husband's job moved us 4 hours away. At first, I tried to keep doing what I had been doing before, but it was just unsustainable. Driving 4 hours each way every couple of weeks and sometimes every week, and sometimes a couple times a week, just wasn't going to work for our family long term. My daughter still had to get to school and get all of her school activities done, and my husband had his work responsibilities, and my job was to keep things running smoothly at home, and I was failing miserably. Luckily, a very sweet couple named Debbie and David, who were right between myself and my parents in age, lived across the street from my parents. At least one of them would stop by just about every day to make sure my parents were doing okay, to meet any immediate needs they had, and even take them to their appointments when I was unable to drive up and do it myself. As you know, it can be really hard for Gen Xers to ask for help. We feel like we need to do it all ourselves. But those sweet neighbors stepped in to help Mom and Dad and me without my even having to ask. They knew I couldn't do it alone, and thanks to them, I didn't have to. They were wonderful and became part of the family. They even celebrated Christmas and Thanksgiving with us last year, and I'm so glad they did. Those were really special times. Last March, just after we got home from our spring vacation, I received a phone call from Debbie and David's daughter. When I answered the phone, it was obvious she was upset. I thought immediately she was calling with bad news about one of my parents. I was wrong. She told me that her dad, David, had passed away during the night. My heart sank. He was such a good man, and I knew that Debbie needed time to focus on her family and grieve the loss of her husband, not worry about checking in on my parents. So the decision was made to bring my parents to live with us. To his credit, my husband never thought twice about it. He just went to work helping to get our home ready for my parents and to facilitate this quick and unexpected move. After we attended David's funeral, we packed up Mom and Dad's necessities and set up a room for them in our house. They still wanted to have their independence, so a plan was set in motion for them to build a tiny home on our property. That became an ordeal, which I will go into in a future episode. For now, I'll just say that they were planning to move into their tiny home around the end of summer and were finally able to move in just before Thanksgiving. During those 8, sometimes long months of being roommates, we learned a lot about each other, about grace and about respect. We also learned that ultimately it was a blessing for them to stay in our home for just a little bit longer. During those months when they had hoped to already be living in their new home, we had some pretty important things happen. My dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure after I had to rush him to the hospital one morning because he couldn't breathe. I'm grateful that I was just across the house that morning when he woke up in distress, in that situation where time mattered so much. Fortunately, they were able to get the fluid off of his lungs so he could breathe, start him on the appropriate medications, and teach all of us about the lifestyle changes he needed to make in order to manage congestive heart failure. He's actually feeling better now than he has in quite a while. A couple of months after Dad's ordeal, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. She went to the ER with bladder pain from urinary retention, and the CT scan they did at the ER showed a mass in her left breast. We never would have known about the mass had she not had that one instance of urinary retention, which was really easily resolved. Breast cancer wasn't even on our radar. There's no family history, and she had a clear mammogram less than a year before. The urinary retention turned out to be a blessing, and it's my personal belief that it was God's way of alerting us to Mom's cancer. Mom had a mastectomy in October, almost 4 months ago now, and they got all of the cancer out. Her margins are clear. Her doctor did prescribe radiation treatments because her cancer was aggressive and they wanted to do all they could to discourage its return. I was able to care for Mom and Dad pretty easily during that time since they were still living in our home. Therefore, the fact that it took a bit longer than expected for them to get settled into their new home seems to have turned out for the best. Of course, now with their health on the upswing, we're all very content with my parents having their own space, getting to live and enjoy life together the way they have for the last 65 years. They're very close by, so we can check on them often. We have an intercom system between the houses so they can just holler when they need me, and they do. And our home health nurse comes by every Thursday to make sure all is well. I don't know what we do without her. It's a pretty good situation for all of us. Mom finishes radiation treatments in about a week, and I'm fortunate that I don't have to work outside of the home right now, so I've been able to take her every day for the last 6 weeks. All of this definitely keeps me busy, and even though some days it's not as easy to realize it, I'm truly blessed. And tired. I'm blessed and tired, and that's okay. I'm sure you can relate. I'm so happy you've decided to spend this time with me today. I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, friend, let's keep on juggling.
Nobody's ever gonna take your place. Yeah, I think we should meet in the middle. I follow you 'cause you're the light of the day. I need you like you need me, it's so simple. It's so simple.